Unwilling witness. A dangerous secret uncovered. The air was thick with fog. A cold chill clung to everything. The streetlights flickered in the distance. Barely enough light to see, but enough to feel the unease creeping in. Emma walked slowly, her footsteps muffled on the wet pavement, her breath visible in the air, swirling like ghosts. She glanced around. The world was quieter than usual. Too quiet. She hadn't planned on walking home this late, but her phone had died. No calls, no way to contact anyone. Just her and the cold, empty streets. She heard a sound, faint at first. A rustle. A footstep, maybe? She froze, tensed. Straining her ears, she listened. The sound was closer now. A shuffle. A dragging step. Her heart beat faster. Her senses heightened. She moved to the side, pressing against the stone wall of a closed shop. Her body still as a statue. Waiting. The figure came into view. A man, his face hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. But his gait, it was odd. He stopped just a few feet away. Too close. She held her breath, barely daring to move. The man looked around, his eyes scanning the dark. Emma ducked lower, hoping he hadn't noticed her. The tension in her chest was unbearable. Then, the man did something strange. He reached into his jacket. A glint of metal caught the dim light. A knife. Her pulse raced. Her mind screamed to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She watched as he stepped toward the alley, the shadows swallowing him whole. She needed to leave, to get far away, but something made her pause. A strange pull, an instinct telling her to stay. The sound of muffled voices drifted from the alley. Low, urgent whispers. Then, a scream, a sharp, piercing cry that cut through the fog. Emma's breath caught, her body frozen in place, her mind racing. Was someone in danger? What had just happened? She took a cautious step forward, peering around the corner. A figure lay on the ground, the man with the knife standing over them. Her heart skipped a beat. She should leave. She knew she should, but her feet didn't move. Her eyes were locked on the scene before her. The man looked up. Their gazes met for a split second. Then he disappeared into the darkness. Emma stood there, breathless. The fog swirling, closing in around her. Had he seen her? Was she now part of something far worse? She stumbled back, almost tripping on the pavement, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What had just happened? What would she do now? She couldn't ignore it, couldn't walk away, but every instinct screamed at her to run. Her legs trembled as she backed away. Her pulse hammered in her ears. The alley was silent now. Too silent. Emma turned, the urge to flee gripping her. But the thought of what she'd just witnessed paralyzed her. She had to know more. With each step, she tried to control her breathing. The night air felt colder, heavier. The weight of what she'd seen pressing on her chest. The scream still echoed in her mind. A cry for help. But what if she was wrong? What if she'd misinterpreted everything? She hesitated, then, without thinking, moved toward the alley. Her shoes clicking softly on the wet pavement. Her heart raced in her throat. Her eyes darted to every shadow. As she reached the corner, she crouched low, peeking just enough to see the scene. Nothing had changed. The body still lay on the ground. A man's figure approached, moving quickly. Another one. This one had no hood. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He bent down beside the figure. Emma couldn't make out the words, but she could see the urgency. The man tried to shake the figure, but they didn't respond. Then, as he turned, Emma felt a sharp pain in her chest. A sudden realization. She wasn't alone. She spun around, just in time to see the man in the hood. He had returned. The knife gleamed in his hand. He was standing right behind her. "Don't make a sound," he whispered, his voice cold. Her body froze. The fear gripped her like a vice. The man's breath was shallow, quick. He was watching her closely. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't fight him off. There was no escape. Her legs were locked in place, unwilling to move. "Did you see anything?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Her mouth went dry. She couldn't answer. Her eyes darted between the man and the figure in the alley. The man took a step closer. The knife gleamed brighter now, reflecting the dim streetlight. The smell of metal filled the air. "Answer me," he demanded. Her throat tightened. Her stomach twisted. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. He moved even closer, his face now inches from hers. He reached out, grabbing her arm with cold, unyielding fingers. "Tell me you didn't see anything." Her mind raced. What was he going to do? What would happen if she told him the truth? Everything seemed to freeze in that moment, her heart pounding in her ears. The alley grew darker, the fog thicker, and in the silence, she understood one thing. She couldn't walk away now. The grip on her arm tightened, his fingers digging into her skin. She winced, but kept her eyes on his. "Please," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please let go." He didn't respond. His eyes narrowed, cold and calculating. He dragged her a few steps backward, into the shadows of the alley. The fog swirled around them, as if it wanted to swallow everything whole. Her heart hammered in her chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. The question hung in the air. His lips twitched into a thin, grim smile. "You shouldn't have seen anything," he muttered. His grip never loosened. "I can't let you walk away." Emma's mind raced. She needed a way out. Her eyes scanned the alley. No escape. The figure on the ground still lay motionless. The man beside them didn't seem to notice her anymore. They were focused on something else. Her body tensed. She was running out of time. She took a slow, deep breath. Then, with every ounce of strength, she yanked her arm free. The man staggered back in surprise, just enough for her to break free. Without thinking, she turned and ran. The world around her was a blur. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She pushed herself harder, faster, not daring to look back. The fog thickened with each step, clinging to her like a heavy shroud. She could feel the man gaining on her, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Her legs burned. Her lungs screamed for air. She rounded the corner, the alley slipping out of sight. But the footsteps kept coming. Then, a shout. "Stop." The voice was closer now. Too close. Emma's body screamed at her to keep going, to keep running. She turned the next corner, but this time there was nowhere to go. The street ahead was empty, a dead end. Her heart sank. She was trapped. The footsteps stopped behind her. She could feel him right there. She slowly turned around. The man stood a few feet away, the knife gleaming in his hand. "I told you," he said, his voice low. "You shouldn't have seen anything." Emma took a deep breath, her body trembling. She needed to think. There had to be a way out. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't the only one in danger now. The man took a step forward. The blade of the knife glinted in the dim light. Emma's heart raced, her mind scrambling for a plan. She was trapped, her back pressed against the cold brick wall. No way out. The man's eyes were cold, but there was something else, something in his posture. He was nervous. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice shaky. "Just let me go." He paused. His eyes flicked to the side, as if hearing something. A moment of hesitation. Emma saw it. A chance. Her hand shot out to the wall, beside her, grabbing anything. Her fingers closed around a small, rusted pipe. She swung it toward him. The man staggered back, surprised, but his grip on the knife tightened. Emma's breath was ragged, her body shaking with fear. But she didn't stop. She swung the pipe again, this time connecting with his wrist. He yelped, the knife falling to the ground. Emma didn't waste a second. She grabbed the knife, feeling the cold metal in her hand. He stared at her, his face twisted with rage. You think you can stop me? He growled. Emma didn't answer. She only took a step back, keeping the knife raised. A new noise reached her ears. Footsteps. She turned quickly. A shadowy figure appeared at the end of the alley. It was the man from before, the one who had been with the figure on the ground. He was running toward her, his face pale, his breath coming in short bursts. Emma didn't hesitate. She bolted. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew she couldn't stay there. The alley stretched ahead, dark and winding. She heard the man's voice behind her, shouting, but she didn't dare look back. Her legs burned, her feet pounding the pavement. Her mind screamed for her to keep moving, to not stop. Then, out of nowhere, a car's headlights flickered on. Emma's heart leapt. She sprinted toward it, her legs aching with every step. The car slowed as she neared, and the window rolled down. A voice called out, "Get in!" Without thinking, she dove inside. The car sped off, the sound of tires screeching on the wet road. The man didn't chase her. Not this time. Emma sat back in the seat, breathing heavily, trying to steady herself. She glanced at the driver, a stranger. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, his voice full of concern. Emma nodded, unable to speak. She felt the weight of everything she'd just experienced. The strange man, the body in the alley, the scream that still echoed in her mind. And now, the car speeding through the night, taking her far from that dark, foggy alley. But she knew it wasn't over. Not yet. The car sped through the fog, the headlights cutting through the thick haze. Emma gripped the edge of the seat, her breath still shaky. The driver glanced at her, his expression tense. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse. The man's eyes flickered toward her, but he didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the road. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Just someone trying to help," he said. But there's something about his voice, something off. Emma studied him closely. He wasn't young, but he didn't look old either. Dark hair, sharp features. His eyes were dark, almost too dark, a quiet intensity in them. She didn't trust him, not completely. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, trying to gauge his reaction. He glanced at her again, a brief flicker of something. Annoyance? "No," he replied curtly. "Just passing through." Emma's mind raced. Everything was spinning. Her heart still hadn't settled. What had happened back there? What was that man doing with the knife? What was the body on the ground? The questions pressed down on her, but she couldn't ask the driver. Something about him made her uneasy. She sat back, staring out the window, the darkened streets blurred by the fog. Minutes passed in silence. Then, out of nowhere, the driver spoke again. "You saw too much tonight," he said, his voice low. Emma stiffened. Her grip tightened on the seat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She could hear his breathing, steady, deliberate. Then his voice again. "It's not safe for you." Emma's heart skipped a beat. She turned to face him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" The man didn't look at her, but his voice was colder now. "They'll come for you." Emma's stomach dropped. "Who?" she whispered. He didn't answer. The car turned sharply. A street she didn't recognize. The buildings seemed darker here, more isolated. Something wasn't right. Emma's skin crawled. Her instinct screamed at her to get out, to run. She glanced around. The street was empty, silent. Where was he taking her? The car slowed, and finally stopped in front of a rundown building. No lights, no sounds, just the dull hum of the engine. The man looked at her now, his eyes almost too intense. "You need to listen carefully," he said. "If you want to survive this night, you have to stay quiet. Stay hidden." Emma stared at him, her mind racing. What's going on? Who are they? What do they want? The man shook his head, his face grim. "They already know you saw him." The words hit her like a punch. She felt the cold chill of fear creeping back. Her hands trembled. "They'll come for you," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma had no choice now. She was trapped, and the night was far from over. The silence in the car felt suffocating. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living thing. Emma's thoughts swirled, a chaotic mess of fear and confusion. Who were they? Who was the man she had seen in the alley? And why had the driver come to her rescue? But something gnawed at her, something she couldn't ignore. She didn't trust this man. The tension in the car thickened. She wanted to ask more questions, but the words stuck in her throat. The driver finally broke the silence, his voice dark and low. "They don't let go easily." Emma's blood ran cold. Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They're after him," he said, his gaze still locked on the road. "The man you saw, and if they know you saw him, they won't stop until they find you." Her chest tightened. She couldn't breathe. The man's words hung in the air, the weight of them sinking in. "But why would they care?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. "Why does it matter?" The driver's eyes flickered briefly toward her, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the door, sliding out of the car. Emma watched him closely, her hand still gripping the door handle. He turned to face her, his face grim. "You need to stay here," he said. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Her heart pounded. "Stay here," she repeated, her voice rising in panic. "Where are you going?" He didn't answer, just gave her a sharp look, his eyes hard. Then he vanished into the darkness. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving Emma alone in the car. The engine hummed softly, but the air felt still, frozen. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? She couldn't sit here forever. She needed answers. Emma took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the door handle. But before she could make a move, a sound broke the silence. A faint scraping noise, coming from the street. Her head snapped up. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The scraping grew louder. It was rhythmic, the sound of something being dragged. Her heart skipped a beat. A figure emerged from the fog, a tall shadow, shifting, moving. The scraping stopped, and Emma's blood froze in her veins. The figure was right in front of her now, just outside the car. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the man, the one from the alley. His hood was pulled low, but there was no mistaking him. He looked straight at her, his dark eyes locked onto hers. Her pulse raced. She couldn't move. The man reached out, his hand brushing the car window, and then, in the stillness of the night, his lips curled into a slow, cruel smile. Emma's stomach churned. She pressed herself back against the seat, her body trembling uncontrollably. What was he doing here? How had he found her? His smile widened. A low chuckle escaped his lips. "I knew you'd try to run," he whispered, his voice sending a chill down her spine. Her mind raced. The driver. Was he coming back? But all she could hear was the man's voice, growing louder. "You can't hide from me. Not now." The car door handle. Her fingers felt numb as she gripped it, but she couldn't make herself move. The man tapped the glass again, his eyes never leaving hers. The fog thickened, and the night swallowed them whole. Emma's breath quickened. Her eyes locked on the man outside. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest, each beat a deafening thud. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his smile growing wider, taunting her. Her hands shook, the door handle cold and foreign in her grip. She wanted to open the door, wanted to escape, but her body wouldn't obey. The scraping noise started again, louder this time, closer. She knew he was getting ready to drag something heavy. Her mind raced. What was he going to do? The seconds stretched like hours, the silence between them unbearable. Then, from the corner of her eye, a flash of movement. The driver. He had returned. Emma's heart surged. He was running toward her. The man outside saw him too. His eyes narrowed, his smile faltering. The driver reached the car, slamming his hand against the hood. "Get out," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Emma snapped out of her daze, throwing open the door. She didn't hesitate. She bolted, fleeing into the foggy street, the sounds of her footsteps lost in the thick mist. The driver was close behind her, but the man was faster. Before Emma could reach the next block, the figure was already in front of her, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Emma froze, the dread sinking deeper into her gut. The driver reached for his jacket, pulling something from inside. A gun. "Stay back," the driver warned, his voice sharp, steady. The man in front of them didn't flinch. He simply looked at the gun, then back at the driver. "You're not going to stop me," the man said, his tone dripping with confidence. Emma's legs trembled, her breath shallow. She didn't know what was happening, why this man was after her, why he was so determined, but there was no time to question it. The driver moved, his gun raised, and then gunfire. A deafening crack split the air. Emma's heart lurched. The man in front of them stumbled, grabbing his side. He didn't fall. He didn't even seem phased. With a growl, he reached into his coat, pulling out something small and black. Another gun. The driver lunged toward Emma, shoving her to the ground. Another shot rang out. Emma's world spun. Her ears buzzed with the ringing. She could barely make sense of what was happening. But one thing was clear. They were in deep. The man raised his weapon, aiming it at the driver. A flash of movement caught Emma's eye. A figure appeared behind the man, a blur in the fog. A second shot. This time, the man staggered, his grip on the gun weakening. He dropped to his knees. Emma could barely breathe. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion. The stranger behind the man stepped into view. Another figure, a woman, her face masked, her eyes sharp with resolve. "Stay down," she said to Emma, her voice urgent. Emma didn't question it. She pressed herself against the pavement, barely able to think, barely able to move. The woman approached the downed man, her movements quick, precise. "He's not the one you need to worry about," the woman said to the driver. The driver lowered his gun, his eyes scanning the street. Emma's head spun. Who were these people? What had just happened? "Is it over?" she managed to whisper, her voice hoarse. The woman glanced back at her, her eyes cold. "For now," she said. But Emma knew this was far from over. The night was just beginning. The woman's words echoed in Emma's mind. For now, it felt like a warning. The driver crouched beside her, his hand on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Emma nodded, too stunned to speak. She didn't know what to say, who to trust. The woman had approached the fallen man, checking his pulse. Her face was unreadable, her movements clinical. "We need to go," the woman said, standing up, eyes scanning the street. The driver nodded sharply, pulling Emma up to her feet. "Come on, move." They didn't wait. Without another word, They started walking, the woman leading the way. Emma stumbled, her legs weak beneath her, but the driver kept a steady hand on her back. The fog was thicker now, shrouding the street like a heavy blanket. The only sound was their footsteps, soft against the wet pavement. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced behind them, but the street was empty. The man, the woman, all gone. No sign of the chaos from moments ago. The driver turned down an alley, motioning for Emma to follow. She hesitated but obeyed, fear still clinging to her. The alley was dark, narrow. She could hear the faint sound of water dripping from the gutters, the distant hum of traffic, but nothing that felt familiar. They reached an old door, hidden behind a large trash bin. The woman knocked twice, sharp, deliberate. There was a pause, then a soft click, and the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, his face hidden in the shadows. "Is she okay?" he asked, his voice gruff but concerned. The woman nodded, gesturing for Emma to step inside. "She's fine. For now," she said. Emma stepped through the door, her eyes adjusting to the dim light inside. The room smelled of old wood and dampness, a sharp contrast to the cool night air. "Sit down," the woman instructed, leading Emma to a chair by a small table. Emma did as she was told, still shaking from everything that had happened. The man closed the door behind them, locking it securely. "What's going on?" Emma finally managed to ask, her voice weak but desperate for answers. The woman met her gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something almost pitying in her eyes. "You're in danger," the woman said, her voice low and steady. Emma's stomach tightened. She could feel her heart racing again. "Who are you people?" Emma whispered. "Why is he after me?" The woman glanced at the man in the shadows, then back at Emma. "We're not the ones you need to fear," she said. "There's a group that operates in the shadows, a group that takes what they want." "Who are they?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The woman hesitated, then stepped closer, her face grave. "They're the ones who want to make sure nothing gets out. You saw something tonight you shouldn't have, and now they'll come after you. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you don't speak a word." Emma felt her chest tighten, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen something. She had seen it all, the man, the knife, the body. But what did it all mean? The man in the shadows stepped forward, his eyes cold and piercing. "You've been marked, whether you know it or not." The woman glanced at him sharply, then returned her attention to Emma. "All we can do now is help you stay alive." Emma looked between the two of them. Her head was spinning, but one thing was clear. She was caught in something far darker than she had imagined, and running away wasn't an option anymore. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air, the truth sinking in slowly. She was trapped. "How do I stay alive?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. She could barely breathe, let alone think. The woman's eyes softened, but only for a moment. "First, you don't trust anyone outside this room." She glanced at the man, who was still standing in the shadows, his gaze fixed on Emma. Emma's mind raced. Her pulse was still erratic from the adrenaline, but the fear was something new now, the fear of what she didn't know. "Why me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did they come after me?" The woman stepped closer, her tone turning serious. "It's not about you. Not really. It's about what you saw." Emma swallowed, her throat dry. "What did I see?" "You saw a deal go wrong," the man in the shadows said, his voice low and almost detached. "A trade that wasn't supposed to be interrupted. You saw the man with the knife, and you saw the body." "Who was the body?" Emma asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The woman exchanged a glance with the man, then answered. Someone important. Someone who shouldn't have been on the table. The table, Emma echoed. What do you mean? The man stepped forward, his shadow stretching long across the floor. You don't want to know the details, but you've got a part in this now, whether you like it or not. Emma shuddered. She didn't want to be part of this. She just wanted to forget, to walk away. But that wasn't possible anymore. The truth was staring her in the face, cold and unforgiving. The woman reached for a file on the table, sliding it toward Emma. This is what we know about them. The group that's hunting you. Emma opened the file slowly, her fingers trembling as she flipped through the pages. Names, photos, connections. She didn't understand half of it, but it didn't matter. One thing was clear. The people chasing her were dangerous. The man in the shadows spoke again. These are the people you'll never see coming. They work in the dark. You don't know who they are, but they know you now. Emma's chest tightened. The room felt smaller, like it was closing in on her. What do you want from me? She asked, her voice almost pleading. The woman's eyes softened again, but there was no comfort in her gaze. We want to help you disappear, to get you out of their reach. Emma looked up at the woman, searching her face. Help me, she repeated. You just want me to run. Yes, the man said, his voice sharp. Run, hide, and stay silent. Emma's stomach twisted. Run, hide. It was that simple. But as she looked at the man's face, she knew it wasn't. How long will I have? She asked. Before they find me? The woman exhaled, her expression grim. Not long. Emma felt her world tilt. The air was thick, the silence deafening. You won't be safe anywhere, but we'll do what we can. The man turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he stopped. Remember this? Emma, he said, his voice low. They'll stop at nothing. The door creaked open, and they left her there, alone in the dimly lit room, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. In the darkness, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was still watching her, and in that moment, Emma knew her life had been completely rewritten. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Emma in the stillness of the room. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind reeling with everything they had said. She stood there for a long time, staring at the open file on the table. The names and faces blurred together. The weight of the truth crushed her chest. They'll stop at nothing. The man's words echoed in her mind, a constant, insistent reminder of her new reality. She ran her fingers over the photos, trying to make sense of it all. But the more she looked, the less she understood. All she knew was this. She was no longer just an innocent bystander. She was tangled in something dark, something dangerous, and there was no way out. She glanced at the window, the night outside so quiet, the fog now thick enough to swallow the streetlights. A sudden thought struck her, cold and unsettling. What if they were already here? What if they had been watching her from the moment she stepped into the car? Her pulse quickened. She had to move. Now. But where could she go? How could she escape? Her mind spun, the file still open on the table. She scanned it one last time, eyes catching on a name she had seen earlier in the alley. The one that had been whispered in the shadows. The man with the knife. She couldn't forget his eyes. Cold, empty. But something about them was familiar. Her heart skipped a beat. Had she seen him before? The thought gnawed at her. She felt a shiver run down her spine. There was a knock at the door. Emma froze, her blood turning to ice. The knock was soft at first, barely audible, but it was there. The sound sending a shock of panic through her body. Her instinct screamed for her to hide, to run, but she couldn't move. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside, casting a long shadow across the room. It was the woman. She was alone. Her face was more serious than before, her expression unreadable. "Emma," she said softly, closing the door behind her. Emma didn't say anything. She just watched the woman, her mind still racing. "Are you all right?" the woman asked, her tone less forceful now, almost kind. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She nodded instead, her throat tight. The woman didn't move at first. She just looked at Emma, studying her, as if weighing something in her mind. "You need to go," the woman said finally. "Right now. It's not safe here." Emma's stomach churned. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why is it not safe?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the door, her hand hovering near her side. She didn't answer immediately. Then she spoke, her voice low and urgent. "Because they're here." Emma's blood ran cold. Before she could react, the woman grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the back door of the room. "Move," the woman hissed. They hurried through a narrow hallway, their footsteps muffled on the old floorboards. Emma's mind was still reeling. Was this it? Was this the moment when everything unraveled? The woman shoved open the back door, and they spilled out into the alley behind the building. Emma's heart raced. The alley was dark, the fog now thicker than ever, obscuring everything. "Where are we going?" Emma gasped. The woman didn't answer. She just kept moving, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Emma's legs burned as they moved faster, but she didn't dare slow down. The woman stopped abruptly, motioning for Emma to duck behind a pile of crates. Emma crouched low, her body pressed against the cold brick wall. She tried to steady her breathing, straining to hear anything above the pounding of her heart. The woman pulled something from her coat, a small device with blinking lights. Emma watched her closely, trying to make sense of the situation. "We need to get to the safe house," the woman muttered, her eyes flicking to the device. "They're closing in. We don't have much time." Emma felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She didn't know who they were, but she knew one thing. She had to get out, and she had to get out now. The woman's grip on the device tightened, her knuckles white. Emma could feel the tension in the air, as if every second mattered. "They're too close," the woman muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "We have to move." Emma nodded, her pulse still racing. She didn't question it. She simply followed. They darted from the alley, moving quickly through the fog, keeping low, almost invisible against the shadows. Every step felt heavy, the ground beneath her feet unsteady. Emma glanced around, feeling the weight of her surroundings pressing in on her. It was as if the whole world had shrunk to this narrow path, the fog closing in tighter with every step they took. The woman led them through a maze of streets, each one more deserted than the last. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The tension between them was palpable, like they were on the edge of something terrible. Emma's eyes kept darting to the buildings around them, half expecting someone to jump out from the darkness. But the streets were empty, too empty. The woman stopped suddenly, glancing over her shoulder. "They're getting closer," she whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "They must know where we're heading." Emma's heart skipped a beat. Who were they? How could they be tracking them? The woman reached into her coat, pulling out a small, sleek gun. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "You need to stay quiet," the woman said, her voice colder now. "And stay behind me." Emma nodded, her body stiff with fear. The woman moved forward, her steps silent, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. They approached a building, tall, dark, and nondescript. The safe house, maybe? Before Emma could ask, the woman motioned for her to stay still. "Wait here," she ordered, her voice firm. Emma did as she was told, watching from behind a nearby dumpster, her breath shallow, her body taut with fear. She could hear the distant sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The woman had disappeared inside the building, and Emma was left alone in the darkness. Time seemed to stretch out, each second dragging like an eternity. Then the footsteps grew louder, closer. Emma's chest tightened. She had to stay hidden. She had to stay silent. The footsteps paused, right outside the alley. Emma held her breath. Her heart thudded in her ears. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving slowly, deliberately. It was a man. He was tall, his features obscured by the dim light, but Emma could feel his presence, like a predator stalking its prey. He glanced around, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley. He was looking for something, someone. Emma's stomach churned. She was trapped. The man stepped forward, his boots tapping lightly against the pavement. Closer. She had to do something. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but there was no way, no escape. She clenched her fists, waiting. The man took another step, his gaze sweeping the alley once more. Then he stopped, dead in his tracks. He turned, right toward Emma, her breath caught in her throat. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The man was looking directly at her now. For a long, terrifying moment, he didn't move. He didn't speak. Emma's mind raced. Should she run? Should she fight? But before she could make a decision, the woman reappeared. She stepped out from the shadows, her gun raised, aimed at the man's chest. The man didn't flinch. Move, the woman commanded, her voice sharp and controlled. The man's lips curled into a slow, mocking smile. Not so fast, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emma's blood ran cold. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The woman's finger tightened on the trigger. Get back, she yelled to Emma. Emma didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted, moving as fast as she could, her feet pounding against the ground. The sound of a gunshot rang out. The world seemed to slow, the sound reverberating in her ears. She didn't stop running, not until she heard another voice, a new voice, coming from the direction of the safe house. Don't let her get away. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the alley. She couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The second voice had been clear, sharp with urgency. Who were they? Who was after her now? The woman had been her only chance, and now she was gone, along with whatever fragile hope Emma had left. Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything, but there was no time to think, to plan. She kept running, her lungs burning, her legs weak from the fear and adrenaline coursing through her. But no matter how fast she ran, the feeling of being chased never stopped. The darkness around her seemed to grow thicker, the fog swallowing her whole. She turned a corner and found herself in a narrow street, lined with old buildings. It was almost completely silent, the quiet oppressive, but then a sound. A door creaked open, the sharp click of boots against the pavement. Someone was following her. Emma's breath hitched. She didn't dare look back, but she could hear them getting closer. She could feel their eyes on her, tracking her every move. Her hands were slick with sweat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She couldn't keep running forever. A thought flashed through her mind. The safe house. It was only a few blocks away. She knew the woman had led her there for a reason. Maybe there was still a chance. Maybe she could. A sudden shout interrupted her thoughts. Stop. Emma froze. The voice was harsh, demanding. Her pulse skipped. No. She wasn't going to stop. Without thinking, She darted into a side alley, praying it would be a way out, a place to hide. But as she rounded the corner, a figure appeared, blocking her path. It was him, the man with the knife. His eyes glinted in the dim light, a cold smile spreading across his face. Emma's world tilted. She couldn't outrun him. She couldn't fight him. This was it. "Thought you could get away," he sneered, his voice low and mocking. Emma backed away, her eyes wide with terror. But before the man could take another step, a loud crack filled the air. A gunshot. The man froze, his hand instinctively going to his side. For a moment, everything was still. Then a second shot. The man staggered back, gripping his side, his face twisted in pain. Another figure emerged from the shadows. The woman. She was back, and in her hands, a gun. "Run," she shouted to Emma, her voice filled with urgency. Without thinking, Emma bolted. She ran faster than she ever had, the sound of her breath in her ears, the pounding of her heart deafening. She didn't stop until she reached the door to the safe house. The woman was already there, waiting for her. They didn't say a word. There was no time. The door slammed shut behind them, the lock clicking into place. Inside, it was safe for now. But Emma knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. The door clicked shut behind them with a heavy finality, the sound echoing in the empty room. Emma collapsed against the wall, her breath ragged, her heart still pounding in her chest. She was shaking, but she couldn't tell if it was from fear or relief. The woman didn't speak immediately, but her presence was calm, steady, like a steadying hand in a storm. Emma glanced around the dimly lit room, the walls bare except for a few scattered crates and a single flickering light. It felt almost temporary, like it wasn't meant to be a home, but a refuge. The woman moved across the room, checking the locks on the door, ensuring every precaution had been taken. She glanced at Emma only once. "You're safe," she said, her voice soft but firm. For now. Emma swallowed hard, her throat dry and sore from running, from everything. Her eyes locked with the woman's, and for the first time in what felt like hours, she spoke. "What now?" The woman paused, her gaze calculating, as if considering the answer carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Now we rest." Her tone softened, just a fraction. "Tomorrow we move again. It's the only way." Emma nodded, but she felt the weight of the situation press down on her again. Resting wouldn't change anything. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why me? What did I see?" The woman took a deep breath, her eyes distant. "You saw the truth," she said slowly, "and in their world, the truth is the most dangerous thing you can possess." Emma closed her eyes, the words sinking in. She didn't know how or why, but she had become a part of something much bigger than herself, something that had no place for anyone who asked questions. The woman turned toward the table, unfolding a map, spreading it out in front of Emma. "We'll keep moving," she said, her voice resolute. "Stay quiet, stay hidden, and we'll figure out how to take them down." Emma stared at the map, a path slowly forming before her. It wasn't going to be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. She couldn't go back to the life she had before. Her journey had just begun, and whatever came next, she knew she would face it head on.